This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Hello, my name is Nicholas Morgan, and this is Turkey Abroad. Joining me this morning is Serdar San. He is a Ph.D. candidate in criminology at the University of Toronto. Serdar, welcome to Turkey Abroad.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you for inviting me.
So the reason why I did opt to invite you is because I read an article of yours written on open democracy. You're second of my guests so far who I've managed to find through that site and finding some really insightful articles about different trends going on in Turkish foreign policy. And in particular, the one I saw was about Turkey's intelligence services conducting abductions abroad. And this has been going on for some time now, at least since 2016, when the failed coup attempt took place. And the most recent case that comes to mind is the abduction of a Turkish-Kyrgyz citizen in Kyrgyzstan several weeks ago, right out from the country. And they accused him of being a member of the Gulenist movement. And Kyrgyzstan, unfortunately, is not the only country who's seen this happen on their soil. We've seen it happen in some cases voluntarily and involuntarily in other countries, whether it was in Europe like Kosovo and Ukraine, or further afield in places like Saudi Arabia and Africa. So the first question would like to ask you, Serdar, is should these Turkish intelligence operations, like the abductions of political foes abroad, really be drawing more serious concerns from its NATO or European Union partners, especially in member states like Germany, where you have a large community of political exiles who've taken up residence there?
Yes, thank you very much, Nick. I believe so. I believe that these kind of transnational repression activities by Turkey, especially these covert intelligence operations like the abductions of political opponents, should draw more serious concern from its Western allies, including the NATO partners and the EU member states. As you know, the Turkish government has unsuccessfully tried to abduct some of its opponents living in European countries as well. For example, in a plot uncovered in Switzerland in 2017 March, two Turkish embassy officials actually allegedly tried to drug and snatch a Turkish businessman living there, who would then be returned to Turkey. And also there is the alleged political murder plot, which was uncovered in Denmark, again in 2017 by the Danish Security and Intelligence Service, PET. So in the beginning of 2017, actually the PET received information about this planned political murder of political dissidents of the Turkish regime who live in Denmark. And they acted on the information and put the would-be targets in safety, according to the news that was reflected in the news media. But when we see, especially after 2013, even before the coup, as the foreign policy of Turkey has started to change, and as Erdogan started to move away from his formerly more moderate stance, more moderate image, and toward a more hardline Turkish nationalism, we see that the AKP government, Turkish government, strengthened its ties to some overseas nationalist groups like Osman and Germania gang, which used to act in Germany. And they were accused of spying on and harassing, threatening Turkish exiles living there. And I think this group was banned back in 2018 by the German authorities. And also we have seen the activities of the Turkish Directorate of Religious Affairs. In Turkish, we call it the Diyanet İşleri Başkanlığı. And it's known that it has served as an instrument of surveilling Turkish exiles living in Germany, particularly in Germany. And also we have very recently seen a physical assault against one of the dissident journalists living in Germany, Mr. Erk Acarer, who was assaulted, as far as I remember, in his own home. So I certainly believe that these are serious concerns for Western allies of Turkey. But in addition to these plots, and other more concrete activities which threaten Turkish exiles living in Western democracies, there are also well-documented cases where Turkish government successfully co-opted local law enforcement institutions in Western democracies, especially the EU member states, in order to persecute its opponents living abroad through the Interpol notification system. Currently, we see that the abuse of the transnational law enforcement mechanisms, especially the Interpol notification system, seems to blur the distinction between democratic and authoritarian regimes, since it involves the democratic ones in this human rights abuses, which are directly connected to the undemocratic internal structures of authoritarian states, such as Turkey, making those domestic right abuses, in a sense, cross-border, because imposing this origin country's restrictions on these individuals in a Western country, in a ostensibly more free environment. So as a Freedom House report from this year, from February 2021, on global scale of transnational repression suggests, it's a very comprehensive report, and I recommend everybody interested in these issues to absolutely read that report. Transnational repression serves now, today, as a means of injecting authoritarianism into another polity. So imposing the origin countries, the authoritarian countries, domestic restrictions on people who live in ostensibly more free countries, more free environments. So therefore, while the immediate targets of Turkey's this transnational repression campaign, not just extraditions, extraordinary renditions, but the Interpol abuse, mobility controls, passport cancellations, etc. I can talk more detailed about this if you want. But all this, while the targets of this transnational repression campaign may seem as the Turkish diaspora and the political exiles living in European countries, the host states, the Western democracies, should understand that it's also a kind of effect on their societies at large. It's a kind of menace to their societies at large as well, because beyond these harms inflicted on these exile and diasporic communities, it a kind of undermines international norms of due process and undermines democracy and human rights in that country. So yes, I believe that Turkey's transnational extraterritorial operations should draw more serious concerns from its Western and NATO allies.
In terms of responding to them, and that seems to be a very delicate kind of like dance that the Western countries have to approach with Turkey, much like anything else. Because, for example, when it comes to other countries that are outside of, say, the NATO bloc or the European Union bloc, who conduct intelligence, or in some cases other covert actions like assassinations, first comes to mind is like Russia, but Russia's not alone. Of course, we hear about like other states like Iran, or even to a lesser extent in the past there was even Vietnam, who've conducted these kind of covert operations inside of the Western bloc. But Turkey's a member of NATO. It was an aspirant to join the European Union for many years, and there's of course a lot of different equities at stake here, like the refugee deal, or now Turkish support over Afghanistan. So do you think that the fact that this threat, this danger, or this challenge is coming from sort of like inside what should be a friendly camp is really causing issues for the West, and really creating countermeasures to some of these extraordinary renditions or other covert actions coming from Turkey?
I believe that in the current context, this kind of acts, this kind of acts of transnational repression that Turkey conducts, especially do not create a kind of real risk of blowback for Turkey from its Western allies at current context. When we look at the picture, as you said, Turkey is an important ally in the NATO alliance, and has long been in the Afghanistan with its military support and etc. And this, I believe that the situation largely depends on the U.S. position and the policy on the new administration policy on broader context of supporting democracy and human rights abroad, and its approach the future policy against Turkey. I think this is a very important factor, the US policy and position, because we see that the European Union and the United States declining willingness to support democracy in Turkey over the last over the last decade, especially during the Trump administration in United States, has a kind of served to stifle the democratizing pressure of Western linkage by reducing the cost of authoritarian behavior for Turkey. And, we see that, a weak international response and a lack of accountability for Turkey's acts of transnational repression so far have allowed and still allow for the Turkish government to continue pursuing its opponents abroad without any serious pushback so far. So I think if this status quo changes, there may be some kind of, a policy change against this Turkish acts, this extraterritorial acts in the near future. But when we look at the current situation, for this kind of targeted sanctions on the perpetrators of transnational repression to be applied, or other kinds of more serious measures to be applied, I think that there needs to be a serious policy change in terms of mainly the United States and then the other European governments and their approach, broader approach towards Turkey in the near future.
Mm-hmm. One aspect, to move away from the West just for a second, actually, that I thought was really interesting to see in your Open Democracy article was actually the fact that many of these operations take place in countries that are not part of course, the Western Bloc. Like,
Yes.
Again, like Ukraine is one example. And Ukraine, we know, has been growing closer with Turkey increasingly in the last half decade or so right now. And we know that it's happening. They've worked together with partners even in like Saudi Arabia, who is generally like a rival towards Turkey in many ways. But then you also have it happening in countries like Kyrgyzstan or Moldova or across Africa, and these are all countries that are in the process of developing their own institutions, developing rule of law, etc. How do you think that these Turkish covert operations actually like undermine these processes in some of these countries that are now looking to really democratize and modernize and try to create newer systems for accountability, like again, like Ukraine or Kyrgyzstan and so on?
I believe so, Nick, actually. And the reason for that, when we look at the broader methods of transnational repression, when we look at the broader issue of transnational repression, we see that the most common forms of extraterritorial coercion or transnational repression, whatever you say, like detentions, unlawful deportations, or extraordinary renditions. This type of operations require the successful co-optation or manipulation of the host country institutions to illegally transfer dissidents, people, back to their own country of origin. And we saw the same thing in the Turkish case. So thus, in the Turkish case, these forcible returns of Turkish nationals, the extraordinary renditions, these Turkish nationals, starting from their extraordinary abductions in a foreign territory, actually were carried out through covert intelligence operations mostly, with the direct participation, support, or sometimes acquiescence of the host countries that these Turkish nationals were residing in, rather than through formal judicial proceedings. So in several cases of these extraordinary renditions, we see that local police or secret service of these countries actually have arrested Turkish nationals, took them into detention, and they were held in incommunicado detention for mostly for a very brief period of time. And then they were secretly transferred to Turkish custody and then flown to Turkey in a Turkish aircraft. So, as the Freedom House report also suggests, in the best documented cases of these extraordinary renditions, there has been a very thin veneer of judicial procedure or legal procedure. Like when the Kosovo authorities actually revoked the residency permits of the 6 Turkish nationals who were abducted, declaring them as a national security threat, and then transferring them to Turkish custody. And also we see that this aggressive campaign, this transnational campaign of Turkey, has actually created some local repercussions, political repercussions in these countries. We see that in the Kosovo, after these extraordinary renditions, the intelligence chief and the interior minister were sacked, because a Kosovo parliamentary investigation actually found that these deportations violated guarantees offered by domestic and international legal procedures. And in Moldova, we saw the same thing. The intelligence chief was convicted and was given a suspended sentence after these renditions. And in Mongolia, also after an attempted rendition, it sparked protests across the country, leading to the release of the individual and a crisis for the Mongolian government, who was actually, that was thought to be aiding in the rendition attempt. So we can very comfortably say that also Turkey's acts of transnational repression are not just a threat to the Turkish exiles and the diaspora communities living in these countries, but to the rule of law in those countries, especially in those countries, as you say, that are in the process of reforming their institutions and democratizing their own system. Because, as I said, most common forms of transnational repression involve very overt legal violations and the successful corruption and co-optation of the institutions of this country, sometimes through, literally bribery of specific officials, and sometimes other extra legal inducements to violate domestic and international legal procedures, maybe some commercial deals, investment promises, etc. So, as the Freedom House report also suggests, this kind of practice actually subordinate the legal order, international legal order, and the rights of these individuals living in those countries to kind of transactions between governments and officials. So, therefore, Turkey's acts of campaign of transnational repression should be considered as a menace to the democracy in these countries, and not just to the Turkish exiles and political opponents living in these environments.
Of course, this whole campaign of transnational repression that's stemming from Turkey, it's in my mind a long arm of their own domestic conflicts inside the country itself. And many of these cases, the individuals who are being extradited or captured abroad, kidnapped abroad rather, are who the Turkish government says are members of the Gulen movement, who of course they were Erdogan's one-time ally during a part of his early rule, and then of course they had the falling out after the 2013 investigations, and of course the failed coup attempt that the Gulenists were said to play a large part in, just broke that bridge between them at long last. And being in the United States, it makes me think about, for example, President Erdogan's attempts to convince U.S. authorities, of course, to say hand over Fethullah Gulen, who, of course, he's living in Pennsylvania, and he's been here since, I believe, at least the 1990s. And the case has been ignored by the Department of Justice in Turkey, and that's had a strain on relations with Turkey. But these kind of countries, like Ukraine or those in Africa, they don't have the same robust institutions like, say, in the United States' case. Do you think that Turkey's actually consciously shifting to some of these countries, knowing that they were less likely to, out of decline to meet Turkey's requests, or because they're dependent on Turkey more in some way than in maybe a more mature democratic country, like, say, in this case, the United States? Do you think it's a conscious strategy on their part?
Yeah, I think it can be, because it's much easier for the Turkish government to manipulate the institutions in those countries that we have listed before, and in order to co-opt the authorities to comply with their extradition or extraordinary rendition requests. And I believe that the actually some kind of material inducements. These are, of course, allegations that are, being circulated in the news media, that have been voiced before. But I think, as the Freedom House report also suggests, this kind of, bribery or material inducements may have also played a role in coercing or co-opting these governments to cooperate, to collaborate with the Turkish government's request of extradition or external rendition of their alleged, their persecuted dissidents living in those countries. For example, as far as I remember, a few days after the abduction from Kenya, I believe, of the nephew of the Fethullah Gulen, I think he was brought back to Turkey because of alleged involvement in the Gulen movement and its activities. There was a news report that Turkish armored vehicle company signed a deal with the Kenyan authorities, and this came just a few days after the abduction. So this kind of news or this kind of allegations inevitably raise the suspicions that some material inducements may also have played role in this extraordinary renditions or perceived dissidents living in those countries. But of course, when compared to more democratic countries, there are some limits to be able to apply these methods of transnational repression, because while some more softer methods like the Interpol abuse or passport cancellations or limit mobility controls may play a role in harassing or threatening or pursuing opponents living in United States or other Western European countries, applying these other harder forms of transnational repression are more easy to apply in such countries who are in the process of democratizing their own institutions. I think it's a kind of, more easier for Turkey to do that.
And you're clearly well read on this topic of transnational repression and how it takes shape. And on this front, that's why I'd like to stay on the topic of Turkey's domestic conflict between President Erdogan and the Gulenists for a little longer, because of course, from Turkey's perspective, the argument that they'll raise is that nobody is listening to their arguments, that the Gulen movement represents a terrorist organization. And when many across the world, whether it's in the West or in these other countries, who don't have a major background on Turkey when it comes to their domestic politics, they don't even know who the Gulen movement is, and they're less likely to understand the history that goes on between the two of them. And it's for example, you might be familiar with the stories that how in Turkey that they say that the Gulen movement, they were responsible for the coup. They had a major influence in many institutions of society, whether it was like law enforcement or the judiciary, and that they represented a sincere anti-democratic threat to the country. And still, as far as they're concerned, nobody is buying that argument. What do you think about these claims against the Gulenist movement in particular? Are they kind of like influence? Is that enough that other countries should think more about Turkey's efforts to like go after them in these kind of means? Like how should they approach this kind of topic related to that movement?
Before maybe talking about this issue, we can provide some general background about Turkey's broader campaign of transnational repression, because we know that a bloody coup attempt on July 15 took place, which resulted in the killing of 250 individuals, unfortunately, in Turkey, which failed to overthrow Erdogan and the AKP government. And following that, the Turkish government applied a massive crackdown on its real and perceived opponents. And Turkey's broader campaign of transnational repression and targets of its transnational repression campaign actually reflect those of targets of its domestic crackdown. So, and this transnational campaign has actually been quite remarkable in terms of its scale, intensity, and the speed with which it escalated, because it gained, a kind of big acceleration after the failed coup attempt on July 15. And because, as President Erdogan managed to consolidate his authoritarian rule after the July 15 coup attempt by sidelining other prominent AKP figures, concentrating more power in his hands, tightening his control over state institutions, which were increasingly deployed against opponents, and gaining effective control over media, his government escalated its practice of transnational repression. So when we come to the targets of this actual transnational repression, as I said, we say that it mirrors those of its domestic crackdown. So far, mostly people suspected to be members of the Gulen movement, which Ankara, as you said, accuses of terrorism and masterminding, organizing the coup attempt, have been targeted in this crackdown following the coup attempt. And since 2013, corruption investigations, which targeted Erdogan and his inner circles, and which raised some really serious claims, evidence against Erdogan and his inner circle, the Gulenists have been accused of establishing a kind of parallel structure, a parallel state inside the Turkish state, because of their alleged excessive influence over the Turkish judiciary and law enforcement. And for example, one of the arguments of the people voicing the argument of their excessive influence over the judiciary is that they have been accused of fabricating evidence and violating due process procedures.
You're talking like the Ergenekon
and Balyoz investigations, which targeted alleged coup plotters inside the Turkish military and their civilian collaborators. And actually, when we come to today, more recently, some evidence against high-level members of the movement is credible in terms of their role in the July 15 coup attempt. Some high-level members of the movement, and it's now apparent that some Gulenist officers took active part in the coup attempt. However, the AKP government, in its arguments for its crackdown on its opponents, on its Gulenist movement, has gone far beyond that, asserting that everybody, all the people associated with the movement are responsible. Even those people who had just studied at Gulenist schools at some time, who had held bank accounts in Gulenist banks, which was a legal bank during that time, before it was closed down, and who had used allegedly Gulenist messaging apps to communicate, and even those who had canceled their subscriptions of Digiturk, a pay TV platform in Turkey, which had removed Gulen movement-related channels during the earlier periods of government crackdown on Gulenists. So when we look at the transnational repression campaign of Turkey, we see that the targets mirror those of the domestic crackdown. So thus, this included teachers and educators working on Gulen-affiliated schools abroad, and business people connected to Gulenist movement in any way, and other perceived dissidents who were targeted over their alleged links to the Gulenists and the coup. So, for example, former civil servants, academics who were arrested or fired from their positions following the coup attempt. So it's worth to note here that there has been little effort actually by the government to link most of these people to the coup attempt itself. Targeting most of these people, targeting them based on a kind of guilt by association or alleged association with the Gulen movement and the coup. But we recently observed that an expansion of this extraterritorial campaign of transnational repression to also include Kurdish and leftist individuals as well. For example, threats and even physical assaults against dissident journalists living abroad. And the most famous example is the Germany. We saw the recent harassment and threats against Can Dündar, who is an exiled journalist living in Germany, and Mr. Erk Acarer, who was physically assaulted last week at his home. And when we look at the broader campaign of transnational repression, we see that the targets actually mirror the people that the Turkish government targeted in its domestic crackdown. And as we say, this is important to also note here. I believe that this topic of extraordinary renditions, abductions have circulated in the media, have been discussed recently. But the Turkeys transnational campaign is broader than that. We see that, you know, the Turkish government, at least since 2016, has resorted to mobility controls. By mobility controls, I mean passport cancellations of perceived dissidents, which aim to keep them, confine them, which aim to keep them under control inside Turkey, or limit the movements of those who are already outside the country. And also we see that falsely reporting as lost or stolen thousands of passports to the Interpol database to limit the perceived opponents' travel and to detain them if they attempt to travel across national borders. And also we see that the refusal to renew passports of perceived dissidents and refusal to provide consular services to perceived dissidents, you know, the alleged Gulenists or other perceived dissidents of the Turkish governments. And another big problem, as I have also mentioned in my discussion a few minutes ago, the Interpol abuse is a serious problem in terms of Turkey's broader campaign of transnational repression. I don't know if you remember, but Turkey has unsuccessfully tried to upload 60,000 names to the Interpol database following the coup attempt, which resulted in some policy changes, possible policy changes, but also some refusal of Turkish requests to add individuals to the system. And also we see sometimes coercion by proxy, what we call coercion by proxy, which means arresting or harassing the relatives of dissidents who live abroad, who still live inside the country. So these are all the issues that constitute the broader campaign of Turkish transnational repression, in addition to this enforced disappearances and abductions of dissidents living abroad.
Mm-hmm. You know, the Interpol one is an interesting one in particular. Not long ago, I spoke to the author behind the Red Notice blog, Yuri Nemitz, here on Turkey Abroad, and we talked about Turkey's abuse of the Interpol system, but also the fact that they're angling to host the next Interpol conference in Istanbul in November. Do you have any thoughts you'd like to share on that?
I'm not very surprised, actually. I'm not very surprised because, you know, this has been a serious issue in, you know, in terms of human rights activists and others, you know, people studying the topic, because, you know, they saw it as a kind of danger if the Interpol presidency falls into the hands of an authoritarian state, you know, because there is already problems, and if that happens, there will be more serious abuse of the Interpol system, which will create much more problems for the democracy activists or opponents of authoritarian regimes living abroad. So I think this is, you know, a serious thing that we need to think about. And I think, you know, the Turkey will try to convert it as a kind of its own propaganda and trying to impose its own, you know, demands and its own picture imaginations of its own opponents to other Interpol member states. And maybe I think this kind of Interpol abuse by Turkey and, you know, the refusal to add the names that Turkey sent and other kind of possible policy changes which we don't know the context of, will inevitably be on the agenda. So I think, you know, we need to carefully follow the development of the conference and the topics discussed in that. So I think that, yeah, it's a very important issue that should be in our agenda, I think.
There's also just one last question I'd really like to ask you, and it's about these going back to these international operations by Turkish security services, and they're taking place in countries that they're looking to develop further relations with and improve their relations. Say in, you know, I used Ukraine as an example, Central Asia, across Africa. These are places where Turkey's investing serious economic and political attention to really build up these ties. But as you mentioned, like in the case of Kosovo and then Moldova, there is a domestic blowback to cooperating with Turkey in these cases. But is there also a risk of a blowback for Turkey itself with these operations that are taking place all over the world?
Actually, as I said before, you know, the broader blowback for Turkish such operations, such extraterritorial operations, in the near future, because these operations have been going on at least since 2016, and although we have seen some domestic blowbacks in countries like Kosovo and Moldova, and protests in Mongolia and Kyrgyzstan following the most recent abduction of, the Turkish Kyrgyz educator from Bishkek, we didn't see a serious, accountability or serious blowback, a pushback against Turkey's such acts of transnational repression, not domestically and not also internationally. Other than that, some, declarations of, we are following this, we are, concerned about these developments, but, in practice, we didn't see any practical pushback, blowback against, against Turkey's or Turkey's institutions, state institutions, or any of its, representatives or politicians. As I said, it completely depends on the, global status quo and, the status of the democracy, and the United States and other Western countries look at or their support for the overall democratization abroad, which we saw an important decline over the last 2 decades, the democratic regression, democratic backsliding in many countries, and including Turkey and Hungary, which are the two most extreme democratic backsliders, although they are kind of, European states. And Hungary is actually a EU member, and Turkey is an aspired EU member for at least 2 decades. But, if the things change, I think what could be done in this context is, in terms of preventing such acts of transnational repression, as I wrote in my piece, the Western countries should continue to urge Turkish officials to stop these practices and respect domestic and international procedures on the extradition of criminals. If they seriously think that, a person is linked to the coup, if is linked to the illegal activities, they should follow the domestic and international legal procedures for the extradition of such individuals. And Western countries should continue to send clear messages that this type of operations are not welcome in their territories. But other than that, in terms of specific measures, as the Freedom House report from this year also suggests, maybe in the future, if this status quo, in case the status quo changed, and if the US policy towards Turkey and its human rights abuses maybe changed, and also, the leverage of United States and EU changes in the near future against Turkey, their pressure changed, we can talk about maybe more targeted sanctions about towards the perpetrators of these acts of transnational repression, and those who facilitate such as revoking or denying visas for entry or asset freezes. And actually, the US law allows for such kind of sanctions of individuals and groups involved in human rights abuses. And other Western countries, I think, have their own Magnitsky legislations which allow for such kind of mechanisms to happen.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Canada's one such country.
Sorry?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but Canada is also another country with, for example, a global Magnitsky Act of their own. And yeah. I'm not sure if the conversations over there really often come back to Turkey on it, as opposed to Russia, who, was the obvious country of mind when it was authored. But I think the European Union then too passed their measure last year, I believe in December, for a similar Magnitsky style system. But in that one's case, Turkey was more, was in mind at the time because the shift between Trump and Biden, and then the Eastern Mediterranean tensions. So do you think that these kind of conversations, these non-US countries, like say in the EU or Canada, is it increasingly in any way involving Turkey and other perpetrators than, of course, Russia?
Yes, maybe not at the moment, but in the future, because as I said, the EU's leverage is a kind of weak, as we have seen it in policy over the last 4 or 5 years after the immigrant deal in March 2016. We have not seen very serious blowbacks for Turkey against its increasing human rights abuses following the coup attempt. So actually, I know that the United States has very recently passed a law which Secretary of State Antony Blinken, I think, declared, which is called the Khashoggi ban, which a kind of bars foreigners who, on behalf of their governments, repress or otherwise pressure dissidents beyond their country's borders. So such tools can be an effective tool of accountability and which will increase the cost of transnational repression in the future for the perpetrators of transnational repression and other people who enable such acts. But in the very near future, as we have seen over the last 4 years, we have not seen any serious blowback. And actually, I believe, in my opinion, that this Interpol meeting, as you said, is approaching, which will be held, hosted by Turkey. I think other serious thing that the Western countries can do in this context is that, is to stop the abuse of international institutions. And the best example is the Interpol, which allow Turkey to manipulate the institutions of democratic countries inside their borders. So because, authoritarian states take advantage of this kind of lack of due process in the Interpol notification system to have their critics and exiles, arrested, detained, and maybe extradited. And in the past, we have seen that many people actually have been detained by Western law enforcement agencies based on notices from Turkey. There's the case of, Turkish-German writer Doğan Akanlı and Turkish-Swedish journalist Hamza Yalçın. They were subject to, extended times of detention without any adequate cause. So I think Western democratic countries should not be cognizant of the fact that Turkey kind of abuses this international law, international institutions to attack its critics abroad, and should take necessary measures to reduce opportunities for Turkey to manipulate their institutions. And, this can include, restricting security cooperation with the Turkish officials, or limiting security cooperation with Turkish officials, or putting additional scrutiny on the requests coming from Turkey. So when we look at the current picture as the more immediate, maybe, measures or the things that can be done in the near future.
This is absolutely something that we're going to continue monitoring, especially as we get closer to that Interpol summit in November. But in the meantime, Serdar, thank you very much for taking the time to join me here on Turkey Abroad. It was a pleasure to have you and have this conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me today.
My name is Nicholas Morgan, and this is Turkey Abroad.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.